Well said. Very, very well said. Jeff, you've been spreading all of these great ideals and great messages through your teaching, your speaking. So I have a very broad question for you. What is next? What projects do you have on the horizon?
When we opened the Roses and Concrete Community School, we were very transparent about that we were going to apply the research that I've just sort of been discussing, right? Like we were going to make real a fundamental shift in the purpose of our practice. And we did that. Like anybody who came there, like you can ask anybody who came to that school, they will tell you, like, I never seen anything like this before. This is fundamentally different and it's special. But what we quickly realized was that we didn't have the metrics to actually measure the impacts that we were seeking. And so that led me on a project with a whole collaborative project with people from around the country. And at the time, I was a member of a group that I helped to found called the Community Responsive Education Group. So it was a group of us in that, and then a group of national scholars, some of the leading researchers in neuroscience and pediatrics and child psychology. And we started really trying to understand, like, can you measure wellness? Can you measure the degree to which a young person is more well for having spent 7 hours with you during that day? And all of these researchers, right, across all of those fields were like, yeah, you can. And so we went to work on a multi-year project to unpack that. Like what first, like what is wellness, right? Because like who's against wellness? Like it's nobody's against wellness. Everybody thinks they're for wellness, but they can't actually tell you what wellness is. Or you might get this sort of like myriad of responses. So we wanted to get some clarity around, well, what do we actually know in the research and practice about what wellness consists of? And then how do you measure that? Right? And so we ended up coming out of this project, we created the first of its kind Youth Wellness Index, which is a tool that can actually measure the well-being of young people and look at how it's changing over time. I knew this intuitively probably as long as I've taught. What this project helped to do was to flesh out for me the research that really then helped me understand why schools struggle so much to use data to drive change. What I realized in doing this project is that the reason that schools haven't figured out how to use data to drive change is because they're looking at the wrong data. So they're looking at reading scores, right? They're looking at math scores. They're looking at attendance. They're looking at infractions with the discipline policy. And then they're letting that outcome data shape the changes that they want to make so that they can get the outcome data that they want. And if you talk to any like systems engineer, they'll tell you like that ain't gonna work because you can't use outcome data to drive process change. You have to have process. So if you don't get the outcomes you want, then you know there's something wrong with your process, right? It's the process that you have to change. But if you don't have any process data, then you guess. You're like, oh, well, let's change this process, right? And that's effectively what happens in schools. We don't like our reading scores, so we guess why those kids didn't get good reading scores. And sometimes you guess right, and then the reading scores go up. But then you can't figure out the next step, like how they went up, but how do we make them go up more? Because you don't actually know. So what the research around those other fields tells us is that and if you talk to a psychometrician, right, this is why psychometricians kind of roll their eyes at how schools approach change, because they actually understand, right, data, right, and they understand psychometrics. And what they'll tell you is that what we measure in schools are lag indicators of youth development. But what we need to look at is what are the leading indicators of youth development? Because if you move the meter on the leading indicators, then the lag indicators change. And that's what we realize at Roses is we don't have a leading indicator metric. And what is the leading indicator? It's well-being. Like kids that are not well, I don't care what curriculum you use, right? If the young person is not well, then they're not going to thrive in school. But if you can turn those investments to really understand how do we take this young person from wherever they are and day after day after day, they're getting a little bit more well because they're with us. What we see in the research is that when practitioners do that, guess what happens to test scores? They go up. Guess what happens to reading? It goes up, right? It's not rocket science, right? It's intuitive, but the reason that schools can't do this consistently is because they don't have the tool to measure the leading indicators of youth development, which is the Youth Wellness Index. So our next project is to take this index that we've gotten validated, that we've tested with thousands of students all over the country, and to take it to a school that is raising its hand and saying, we want to repurpose ourselves. We want to redo our foundation with a centralized focus on youth wellness. We don't want to have a wellness center. We want to be the center of wellness in kids' lives. The next project is to identify that school and engage in a 5-year practice-based research project to study what does it take to rip up the foundation and repurpose a school to fundamentally center wellness. How does that track over time, right, in our data metrics, right? How do kids get more well, and how do they get more well? And what is the corollary response of the other measures, which we absolutely care about? Like, I want my sons to do well on tests. I want my sons to read and write and do math and do science. I do. But I also know that my sons will not do that at any sort of high level if they are not well.